Hi, welcome to the Online Jewelry Academy. I'm John Ahr and I'm your instructor. Today I'm going to show you how to make bezel cups. Now, most people when they get into making jewelry, the first thing that they do is they buy a lot of gemstones. And you can see I've got a nice little collection myself. Now, we all enjoy the color and the beauty of the stones, but unless you know how to set them, they're really not wearable. So I'm going to show you a very simple way to mount these things onto your jewelry projects. Cabochon stones are flat on the bottom and rounded on the top, and they can be set with prongs, but usually this is only reserved for the fine jewelry industry, using very high quality gem material. So setting a piece of carnelian in prongs like this, it's nice, it shows off all the stone, but it's a little overkill. I'm going to show you how to set this stone using traditional techniques. Now, the supplies that you're going to need are a piece of silver. Now, this is a piece of 22 gauge silver sheet, which will make a great backing plate. Now, the backing plate could be a little thinner, but you probably don't want to go thicker than 22 gauge. I'm also going to use some fine silver bezel wire. This is 28 gauge silver, fine silver, that comes in a variety of widths that can be used with various heights of stones. Now, there's also some specialty bezels that you could use, and they look like this. This is a gallery bezel, here's a scalloped edge bezel, and this is a step bezel. Now, step bezel is important because what it will do is it will eliminate the backing plate. You might want to eliminate the backing plate if you're making a pair of earrings and you want them to be a little lighter. This opal is set in a bezel that is made out of a step bezel wire, and you can see if I flip it over, the back of the stone is visible. It's not very beautiful, but it does not having the backing plate lightens things up quite a bit. You'll also notice that this is kind of an odd shaped stone, so it was important to be able to make the bezel specifically for that stone. Now, if you're using commercially purchased and manufactured stones that are cut to standard sizes for production purposes, you might be better off just buying the bezel cups that are made for them. In this case, here's a 14 karat gold bezel cup for a piece of amethyst, and you can see when I put it back it fits right in. Now, these are made if you're producing a lot of pieces in a short amount of time, and especially when you get to these little teeny tiny sizes, it might be better to just use the commercially available bezel cups. Now, the type of bezel that we're going to make is constructed using the wires, and you can see how I've kind of stepped it out a little bit here for you. Now, these two fire opals, I've already made the rings out of the fine silver bezel wire to fit them. And you can see how it fits very snug around the stone. There's not much room for it to wiggle in. Then this ring is applied to the backing plate. And here we have one that's ready to receive this piece of moonstone. Okay, now let me show you some of the tools that we need in order to do this. Now, the most important thing is, of course, your eye protection. If you haven't seen our safety video yet, you might want to take a look at that before you proceed. In addition to the safety glasses, you're also going to need these tools as well. First, what I have is a permanent marker, and I have a fine point on this marker because I want to make a very exact line. I also have a bezel mandrel. Now, this is a small round bezel mandrel. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and they're good for perfecting those little small ones. I may not use it on this project today, but I wanted you to know about it. Now, if a bezel needs to be stretched, you would strike it against this type of a mandrel using a polished hammer. Now, the polish on the hammer is important because we don't want to leave any mar or scar on the bezel to show where we hit it with the hammer. Now, I also have a pair of pliers here. These are forming pliers that are of a half round profile, and these are going to help me to bend that bezel into the right shape. Now, to cut the bezel wire, I have a pair of diagonal cutters, And if I need to refine the ends of my bezel wire, I'm going to use this beauty right here. This is a 45 90-degree cutting jig. Now, it has two layers that open up. The top layer allows me to cut a 45-degree angle. The bottom layer lets me cut a 90-degree angle. Now, in combination with this, I want to use a fine cut file. In this case, I have a half round file. It could be any file with a flat surface and a smooth cut. And I'm using a fine sanding stick. There's another video on our channel that shows you how to make your own sanding sticks. Now, I'm going to be using solder pallions. I'm going to use some hard solder pallions cut to 1 millimeter square. I'm going to be using a pair of tweezers to pick these up with when I get to soldering. And if I need to do any cleanup of the metal, I have a piece of Scotchbrite or some other abrasive sheet that I can clean the corrosion off with. Now, in addition to this, I also have some darkened annealed steel wire. I'm not going to tie anything up with it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to loop it around something, and I'm going to create a little nest like this. Now, this nest is going to be a support that I put on top of a charcoal block. This will allow me to heat underneath my piece rather than directly onto it. So it's just raising the piece up from the charcoal. I also have a heat-resistant surface that I've got the block placed on top of. I have a third hand that's equipped with a pair of insulated cross-locking tweezers, and I have some cream flux, a solder pick, a brush for the flux, and I have a small butane torch. Now this is great because it gets up to the right temperature. You need to get up to at least 1500 degrees to melt your solder. Finally, I have a ventilation system, and this is great for evacuating any fumes that might develop while I'm soldering. And we have a video on our channel for how to make this very simple system. Okay, let me clear the bench and I'll show you step by step how to make this bezel cup. The first thing that you want to do is to make sure that you have the right height of bezel wire. Now, your bezel wire should be tall enough to just bend over the top edge of the stone. If it's below, it won't hold it in. So I have one that's just right. If it's too tall, don't worry about it. You can reduce the height later with a file. Now, once you've selected the right bezel wire, what you want to do is open it up. Now, open it up to make sure you have no kinks in it. And what I would do is make sure that your stone is laying flat on the surface, and you want to just wrap the bezel wire around the stone so that it fits snugly around it. Now, you don't want any gaps and you don't want to bend the wire over. Now, once you have it positioned properly, you want to open up your marker, and I'll turn this so you can see it. I'm going to mark on the outside of the bezel wire exactly where the wire overlaps itself, right there. Okay, so once we have our line, I'm going to straighten out the wire again, and I'm going to use diagonal cutters, and I'm going to cut on the outside of the line. There we go. Now what I want to do is I want to perfect that cut edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my 45 90-degree cutting jig, and I'm going to slide my piece in, and I've cut right to that line, so all I need to do is just put it against the guide, tighten it up, and then I'm going to take the file, the fine cut file, and just slide it across this surface. Now, this tool is made from hardened steel. It won't be damaged by a file going against it. You can even saw against this tool. Okay, so this ensures that this edge will match up with the other side that I've previously perfected. So the two parallel ends will come together and they'll butt up and kiss. So what we want to do is just bend these two ends around. You can use your fingers for this, you don't need pliers. And we're just going to maneuver the material until we get the two halves to just come together, just like that. Now you're ready to solder this together. I've set up the soldering equipment in the way that I like to work. Now, there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, as they say, so if you see other videos, it's not that they're necessarily wrong, it's just that everybody has their own way of working. For me, I like to hold the bezel wire up using the third hand. This way, I can get heat anywhere around the piece. And what you're going to do is you're going to dip your flux brush into the flux and just paint the seam. Now I just need to paint the top of the seam. Some people like to paint both sides. It doesn't really matter as long as you have flux on there, because solder won't run if there's no flux. Next, I pick up the solder using a pair of tweezers. Now the solder pallions should be cut to about 1 millimeter square, and if you've cut them to the correct size, you may need more than one in order to seal your bezel. So in this case, I'm using 3 small pieces of solder in order to make sure that the bezel gets soldered shut. Now you don't want to use too much solder, because too much solder will leave a big lump and then your stone won't fit into the bezel cup. Alright, so we've got flux and solder positioned and everything looks fine. It's time to apply the heat. Now remember, anytime you heat a piece, it's good to have a solder pick in one of your hands just in case you need to move it around a little bit or reposition it. Okay, so we're turning on the torch. Now remember, the Flux is a water-based vehicle that is going to evaporate and maybe even boil and move your pallions. So you may need to reposition them. And you don't want to apply the heat directly on top of the pallions. So I like to put them on the inside so that I can come on the outside in order to heat it and have the solder flow. And there's our solder, and I'm using my pick to make sure that I get solder applied to both sides of the seam. Otherwise it's not going to hold. Just like that. You can move it like icing on a cake. Okay. Turn off the torch. Quench your tool so you don't burn yourself, and then quench your bezel. Okay. Now once you've quenched the bezel, dry it off so you can continue to work with it. And the next step is kind of fun. What you're going to do is you're going to take your stone and you want to push your stone through the bezel multiple times. So I'm just going to stretch it around the stone. There we go. Drop my fingers. And I want to just push the stone all the way through. Now I've done it from the bottom to the top. Now I'm going to go top to bottom, making sure that if this sits correctly, that the stone will go right into it if this bezel is applied to a piece of jewelry. So it fits perfectly. Now it could be slightly tighter to keep it in place like that. That's good. But having a little bit, if it were to drop right through, that's okay. Alright, so now that the bezel is the correct shape, we need to apply it to the backing plate. So bring out your charcoal block, bring out your soldering nest, your bird's nest, and what we're going to do is we're going to put the backing plate directly on the little nest. Now, the easiest way to do this is to just take a bunch of flux and just flux the whole surface. Now flux can burn off, so you want to be generous but not too generous. You don't want to create such a thickness that it causes problems. But a nice thin layer of flux is always good. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we will position our bezel wire on top of the plate. And it's good to use a plate that's just large enough so that you can trim or cut away and you're not having to work close to any edge. Now I'm going to pick up my pallions with my tweezers. The first place that I want to place a pallion is on the inside, just below the seam that I soldered. This will help to keep that seam full of solder and not have it deplete during the soldering process. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take your pallions and you're going to position them against the wall of the bezel about every 3 millimeters. Now take your time and just make sure that you have your pallions completely on or surrounding the interior of the bezel, and that you're right up against that wall. Alright, I have one last pallion to put in, and then I'll do just a quick check to make sure that they're all pushed well against the edges or the edge, and that they're spaced apart properly. Okay, so now I'm ready to apply some heat. Again, make sure you have a solder pick in one hand, ready to move anything that might jump. We'll light the torch. I'm going to start by trying to combust the charcoal directly underneath the piece. So this is a hardened charcoal, and you can see when I hit it with the torch it begins to glow. That's going to give off a reflective heat that will add to the heat of the torch. Now I can bring the torch underneath and apply the heat directly to the bottom. Now you saw one just jump away there. It's not a problem. We've got plenty inside. We can keep going. Now the flux will move through several different phases. It went through being a creamy paste. Now you can see it's kind of a scaly white material, and now it's slowly turning into kind of a gooey jelly type of surface. It's liquefying. Now when the flux becomes transparent, we know that we're pretty close to an annealing temperature, and you can see how it's keeping the piece nice and clean. Now at this point I can put my pick in there and move pieces back against the wall if I need to. And because I have the residual reflective heat from underneath from the charcoal, I can come around and apply heat outside the rim. You don't want to apply your heat directly on top of your pallions because it will oxidize them. So just circle the piece until you reach the melting temperature of the solder. Remember, you have to heat the whole piece to the same temperature in order for the pallions to flow. Okay, so we've gone around and we've melted all of the pallions around the edge. Now you can run your solder pick over that melted seam to make sure that you have no gaps. When you finish, turn off your torch, quench your tool so you don't burn yourself, and then what you need to do is pick up your piece and put it in your quenching bowl. Now let me pickle this for a few minutes, and then I'll show you the next step, how to cut it. The next step towards finishing the bezel cup is to saw it out. When you saw it, be sure to support it on top of your bench pin and saw just slightly outside of the bezel. We remove the excess from around the bezel cup. Then all I need to do is take a file and reduce the backing plate to the edge of the bezel cup. Now our bezel cup is complete. It's ready to be soldered onto a piece of jewelry, or if I had left a little piece of the backing plate exposed, I could have drilled through it and turned this into a pendant. Remember, if you want to make this easier to get the stone in and out, you could drill a hole through the back so that you could push through with something. Hope you've enjoyed watching this video. Check out our other videos related to this same topic, and check out our other videos and products on the onlinejewelryacademy.com. Thanks for watching.